I'm delighted to be able to be with you virtually to present work done in collaboration with Clifton Schor at UC Berkeley and part funded by Magic Leap Inc. Many of you will be familiar with Magic Eye stereograms, invented by distinguished Smith-Kettlewell alumnus Professor Christopher Tyler. These are images that look at first sight like a kind of strange abstract wallpaper pattern, but many people are able, if they stare at them for long enough, to see a shape appear in depth as if standing out in 3D. In this particular example, it's a butterfly. So charming and magical as these are, they're actually rather difficult. Many people find that they can't easily see depth in Magic Eye stereograms, even if their stereoscopic vision usually works just fine in other circumstances. So why is this? Well, one reason is that stereopsis depth perception only works well for a small depth range around fixation. So that means it's really important to get the vergence correct. You need each eye's fovea to be seeing the same thing in order to perceive the butterfly, otherwise the disparity will be too large to fuse. And this is hard in Magic Eye stereograms for two reasons. Firstly, there are no gross overall contour cues to tell you where to fuse. There's only the very fine disparity available in this pattern, and as we'll see, that's quite difficult to use for vergence. Now, normally that could be supported by accommodation. So you also have to focus your eyes at a particular point in space. And because that's normally the same position as you have to point your eyes, vergence is actually neurally constrained to be close to accommodation. But in a Magic Eye stereogram, you have to focus, of course, on the screen plane where the stereogram pattern is, but you have to converge your eyes potentially quite far from the screen plane. So for those two reasons, Magic Eye stereograms are hard. Just to go through this in a little bit more detail, I'm going to introduce some axes which I will use throughout this talk. On the y-axis, I'm plotting accommodation, and on the x-axis, vergence. That's the clinical convention. I'm going to measure both of these in units of diopters. So a diopter is simply 1 over distance in meters. So when I say that an object's at 2 diopters, I mean that it's at 0.5, 1 over 2 meters. And I'm going to distinguish the accommodative demand, which is the distance you need to focus on, from the vergence demand, which is where you have to point your eyes. And obviously in natural viewing, these are the same, and that's represented by this identity line where vergence and accommodative demand are equal. So let's say we start off with an object that's at infinity, so 0 diopters, and then if it moves closer, we are going to have to converge our eyes and also increase our accommodation. And we're going to be moving along this line of natural viewing. So to facilitate this, the visual systems developed neural crosslinks between vergence and accommodation. Evidence for this comes from, for example, the phenomenon of accommodative convergence, or AC. So we find that changes in accommodation cause changes in vergence independently of disparity. So we can demonstrate this by occluding one eye, covering it up, so there isn't any retinal disparity because only one eye is viewing. But then if we place a lens in front of the viewing eye so as to change the accommodative demand, we see that we get a vergence response, even though it clearly can't be driven by disparity. And we can plot the size of that accommodative convergence response as a function of the amount of accommodative demand that we placed upon the visual system, and that's known as the Fourier line. And I've represented it here on the same axes as before. It's a line a little steeper than the identity line because you don't get quite as much convergence response as you placed accommodative demand. And clinically, the slope of that Fourier line is known as the reciprocal of the ACA ratio, the accommodative convergence to accommodation ratio. So the point of these neural crosslinks are to help the visual system ensure that vergence and accommodation stay the same as required by natural viewing. So now I'm back on these axes and I'm using a cross to represent vergence and accommodative demand. So in this example, the cross is on the line of natural viewing, and vergence and accommodation both have a demand of 2 diopters. So that's great, the visual system can respond, and I'm representing response with this circle, and that's also at 2 diopters. Now suppose we perhaps use prisms to change the vergence demand while keeping the A demand fixed at 2 diopters. And for a small conflict like this, even though we're off the identity line, the vergence and accommodative response can still be set nearly independently so as to match the demand. But if we go further away still, using stronger prisms, let's say, so now here's an example where the vergence demand is 3 diopters, but the accommodative demand is still 2 diopters. Now we find the visual system cannot meet that demand. It can get nearly there with vergence, so vergence is maybe 2.8 diopters, but accommodation has been pulled well away from the demand of 2 diopters to maybe 2.6 diopters. And the way I think about this is it's like there's an elastic band pulling it or limiting how far it can go from the line of natural viewing. If we do such experiments with many different combinations of vergence and accommodation, you get a line something like this. So what this shows is that close to the line of natural viewing, accommodative response is staying close to accommodative demand, even though vergence demand is changing, but it can only do that up to a certain point. And beyond that point, increases in vergence demand also increase accommodative response. And actually, they do so even more steeply than they create changes in vergence response. And the slope is similar to that of the Fourier line that we saw earlier. So what sort of model can explain all these phenomena? That's what Cliff and I have been thinking about recently. Control is in essence a negative feedback loop aiming to minimise disparity on the retina. So the input to this system is vergence demand, the output is vergence response, the difference between those two is retinal disparity, and that acts as the error signal which your brain is trying to minimise by controlling vergence appropriately so that you can point both your foveas at the same object and have a nice single image. Now there's a complication which I didn't mention in the previous slide, which is that it takes time to compute retinal disparity. Of course, you don't get given that automatically. What the inputs to the visual system really are photoreceptor activations, and then the brain has to compare the two eyes' images and calculate the retinal disparity, and that takes a finite amount of time. So there's a sensory latency before the disparity error signal becomes available to the vergence control system. And similarly at the other end, you may send a signal down to the eyes to control the ocular motor muscles to alter the vergence, but that's also going to take time, so there's a motor latency. And latencies like these are really problematic for control theories systems in general. They can cause instabilities where you overshoot, and it's just generally a bad thing. So the way the brain appears to handle this is to use predictive control. So rather than actually driving the signal sent to the eyes directly by disparity itself, it uses efference copy, so a copy of the same motor signal sent to the eyes, to work out what the eyes are going to do when the signal reaches them. And in that way, it's able to extrapolate the current disparity into the future. And that means that the control can be driven not by the retinal disparity as it's sensed right now, which is already out of date, but by the estimated future disparity. Now, I'm aware I've gone through that very quickly. It probably isn't very clear. We have a whole paper on it if you're interested, but for the moment, just accept it as a given. It's not going to be important, but I just wanted to explain why the models have this efferent copy signal and this extrapolation circuit here. Okay, so let's zoom in on that control system a little bit more. Now I want to introduce the idea of the fusional vergence limit. So an old idea in the literature is that the sort of results I showed you before, where there's this elastic band keeping you quite close to the line of natural viewing, reflects the operation of a fusional vergence limit. So the idea is there's a limit to how far vergence can be driven solely by disparity, and if you want to go beyond that, you need to recruit accommodation to support vergence, and that's why we see this knee where accommodation starts increasing in order for you to change your vergence response. So let's add that to the model, and that's what I've done here with this saturation block. So a saturation block, as I've represented by this little symbol, the idea is whatever the input, the output will be equal to the input up to a certain limit, and thereafter it will just saturate. So let's say the limits are plus or minus 1 diopter, and you have a situation where the disparity integrator is saying I need vergence to be 4 diopters. Well, only 1 diopter is going to get passed to the eyes. And the way I think about this is that could be that this is driven by a neural population which only includes neurons up to plus or minus 1 diopter, perhaps. Okay, the next thing we need to add is, of course, accommodation. These two systems are working together. And in exactly the same way, accommodation is a negative feedback loop using predictive control. So again, we have an efferent copy. But accommodation, of course, is driven by the future defocus, not the future disparity. And then finally, we want to add in the crosslinks between these systems. That's what I've done here. So we have at the output of the disparity integrator, we have a CA crosslink taking that disparity signal and adding it on to the defocus signal in the accommodation system. And then that combined system is taken and fed back on to the disparity Vergence signal. So those of you who are familiar with model circuit diagrams like this in the literature may be surprised by the way I've done these crosslinks. It's not the conventional way, but we think it has some advantages in explaining the results. So let's think through how this model responds, first of all, in the situation we discussed earlier, where you cover one eye and change the stimulus to accommodation, and you observe an accommodative convergence response. So in the model, in this situation, we can think of the monocular viewing as effectively clamping the disparity to 0. So really, we can just ignore all the disparity-related parts of this model. The accommodation system is continuing exactly as normal, so it's driving accommodation based on the defocus, but the AC crosslink is feeding across some fraction of that signal onto the Vergence control system, and that's why we get accommodative convergence. And you may be able to see, you can work out that actually the ACA ratio, the ratio of the accommodative convergence response to the accommodation response, is actually just the gain of the AC crosslink in this model. Another feature of the way we set up these crosslinks that's quite important is that they enable Vergence to bypass the fusional limit that it has. You can go up from the Vergence system to accommodation following the CA crosslink, and then down again via the AC crosslink to drive Vergence, completely bypassing the fusional Vergence limit saturation block. And the way I want to think about this, a little bit speculatively perhaps, I want to introduce another concept emphasised by Chris Tyler, that of coarse and fine stereopsis. So the picture I have in my mind is that we have fine stereopsis, and it's maybe this that enables very precise disparity-driven control of Vergence to enable fine depth perception and so on, but perhaps that only works up to some fusional limit. Now, blur has a much wider range. We can detect very large blurs, and so that's why it makes sense for Vergence to be supported by AC, so that this defocus signal can help drive Vergence even when the fusional Vergence limit means there isn't a direct disparity driven signal. But then suppose blur isn't available for some reason. Suppose perhaps you're viewing in very bright light conditions so that your pupils are very small and there isn't very much defocus. That's where this CA crosslink comes in, and where the particular geometry that we've chosen is important. So accommodative, the CA crosslink enables accommodation to be recruited to drive Vergence even in the absence of defocus. And I want to suggest that this may use a different neural population, perhaps corresponding to coarse stereopsis. So we know that the visual system can detect very large disparities, even those that are associated with double vision. Kenneth Ogle called this qualitative stereopsis, and maybe it's these that enable the bypass of the fusional Vergence limit. I want to point out the role of the gain parameter of this CA crosslink. You might imagine, oh, well, that should be equal to the CAC ratio, the ratio of convergence accommodation to convergence. But it's not quite as simple as that, because you can perhaps see from the model that that's going to depend both on the gain of the CA crosslink and also that of the AC crosslink. What this gain parameter does do within our model is it controls how much the model prioritises single vision over sharp vision. And that's interesting because in people, there seems to be some aspect of voluntary control over this. So if you're faced with a conflict situation where you can't achieve both single and sharp vision, you can to some extent decide whether you would rather have a single blurred image, people generally prefer that, or you could decide to go for a double but sharp image, for example, if you were very keen to read the text. And our model suggests a way that could be achieved if the gain of this crosslink were to some extent under voluntary control. So how does this model perform in practice when we run simulations of it? Well, actually, you've already seen it in action, because everything I've showed you so far has actually been results of model simulations rather than data. So when I plotted the accommodative and Vergence response with fixed accommodative demand and changing Vergence demand, that was actually the results of this model. And I want to end by testing the model in clinical graphical analysis of the kind that an optometrist or an orthoptist might carry out with patients. So the first thing they would do typically is measure the Fourier line that you've already seen. And again, in fact, that was model simulations. So the slope of that line is set by the gain of the AC crosslink. Then the next thing an optometrist might do is, with normal binocular viewing at 40 centimetres, they would then add lenses in front of the eyes and progressively increase the power until the patient reported that the image appeared blurred. And that's what I've done in my model. And in my model, for a viewing distance of 40 centimetres, so a Vergence demand of 2.5 diopters, it could tolerate a maximum accommodative demand of 4.5 diopters before it experienced blur. You might say, how does a model experience blur? Well, I measured defocus within the simulations, and I chose a slightly arbitrary value of 0.3 diopters for my model's depth of field, just looking at values reported within the literature for humans. And if the defocus exceeded 0.3 diopters, I said, okay, the model's experiencing blur. And then the next thing that clinicians would probably do is explore different combinations of prisms and lenses until the image appeared either blurred or double. And generally people find that the image goes blurred before it goes double. So that's what I've marked on this same plot, same axes as usual. So the y-axis is accommodation, the horizontal axis is Vergence, we've got the green line of natural viewing, the red Fourier line, and then to left and right of the Fourier line we have the blur lines shown in pink, where the model is experiencing defocus of more than 0.3 diopters, and on either side of those we have the blue break lines where the model experiences diplopia. So there the disparity is larger than the value that I chose for Panham's fusional area, and I chose that to be about 0.2 diopters. A single binocular vision is this region I've shaded in green around the line of natural viewing up to the blur lines on either side. Now, I don't have time to go through a detailed comparison with empirical data, and one issue is that people vary a lot, so I would have to match the model parameters to individuals, changing their Fourier, their rest focus, their ACA ratio and everything. But I hope that clinicians within the audience will agree that the simulation is certainly qualitatively performing well. The numbers are reasonable, we're getting key features like the slope of the blur lines being quite parallel to that of the Fourier line, and critically the images are going blurred before they're going double. Even though I didn't cheat, the model's depth of field, as I mentioned, is larger than its Panham's fusional area, but due to the CA crosslink, the model, like people, is working harder to keep vision single rather than sharp. So it's allowing accommodative response to be pulled further away from demand in order to keep Vergence response close to Vergence demand. So that's where we are. This is very much a work in progress, but I'm excited to have had the opportunity to share it with you today. I think it accounts economically for many clinical features. Interestingly, it resolves a long-standing debate in the literature about which crosslink is active when. Is the AC crosslink active or is the CA crosslink active? In our model, both are always active, so that resolves the debate potentially. I've suggested that the fusional convergence limit may reflect or be related to the limits of fine stereopsis and possibly the population within V1. Within the model, the wide range of perceptible blur, so we can see blur well beyond the depth of focus at which it starts to appear blur, is used to support the much narrower range of perceptible disparity. So accommodation is shifting the operating range of Vergence, and the two are complementing each other in this way. And that's achieved directly via the AC crosslink, of course. But the CA crosslink is important in recruiting that AC crosslink when necessary. So if accommodation isn't available, maybe because of small pupils, still potentially the coarse stereo system can detect those large disparities which need dealing with, and the CA crosslink can go and ask for help from accommodation. So you can think perhaps of the CA crosslink as like the faucet that's turned on to enable the AC influence to flow across and drive Vergence. And this is our working hypothesis about the models of Vergence and accommodation which work within our brain to keep our binocular vision usually sharp and single. Thank you.